Welcome to the Workbench and welcome to another episode of Wheels Wings TV. Today we have an extra special treat, and that is one of the very first test shots of Kinetic's new 1/48 scale F-16. Let's have a look. First sprue, no mistake, we have an F-16 here. Forward fuselage up to about the midpoint, as well as the top of the wings, molded all as one piece. Very nice rivet fastener detail on the wings. Nice panel lines. Got our static dischargers molded in place, a little bit thick, and they probably won't survive very long during the construction process, but hey, at least they're there. Panel lines seem relatively sharp. Not the sharpest I've seen compared to, say, Arma Hobby or Tamiya, but definitely on par with, say, maybe Edward. Definitely looking good. They are consistent, so even coming around the sides of the fuselage, they are consistent all the way around. Don't have shallower and deeper areas, so when you put a wash, that means that's going to stay nice and consistent. Not going to be a lot of wash in one place and none sticking in another. Got our bird slicers molded in place there on the nose. Obviously some separate inserts here and for the Vulcan gun. Can't say I've seen these on an F-16 before, but then again, I'm not an expert. Cockpit is molded. Cockpit tub here with some detail molded, and of course we have a single seat fuselage and a single seat tub, which means probably a good bet we're going to see some two-seat F-16s coming out from Kinetic. Simply swap out this one sprue for a new two-seat fuselage and cockpit, and I'm pretty sure, I would assume everything else is going to be exactly the same. As opposed to some other companies that have done F-16s, in which case it's one and done. Kinetic is obviously going to cater to as many variants as they can. I mean, why not? But definitely off to a good start. No noticeable flash around the edge. Ejector pins where they don't matter, so a non-issue. But yeah, looking good so far. Next sprue, we've got some pieces of our exhaust nozzle molded in multiple parts, so probably taken some design cues off of the F4 Phantom from Tamiya. Some nice detail with the inner and outer petals molded very nicely. May want to, if you're not going to replace this with a resin piece, take a very fine scribing bit and maybe just add a little bit of depth in there so that'll hold a wash nicely. A little bit of a sink mark, a little bit of shrinkage there. But that is a relatively thick piece of plastic, and this, once again, is an early test shot, so there are going to be little things like that they're going to be sorting out as they go. Got obviously our intake trunking here, as well as the fuselage around the intakes. Now we do have some ejector pins on the inside of the intake that are going to have to get sorted out before that goes together. As well, being in two halves, we're going to have to take care of those seams. So hopefully that won't be too big of a deal. Got some nice detail on the inside of what I assume are the the doors for the main landing gear bay, two different versions here for different variants. Got inner part of the exhaust nozzle, the shroud for the rear fuselage, got the actual lip of the intake right here. Of course, we got the faces of the engine, the flame holder for the afterburner. Looks like we got a couple of different options for landing gear, so more clues for different variants, different struts. Once again, panel lines aren't the super sharpest I've ever seen, but they are consistent all the way around, which I would say is better than having them sharp in one place and not in the other. We do have some very small ejector pins on the inside of the exhaust nozzle here. Those are going to probably require a little bit of filler and some sanding. I suppose the only other option would be to have all those little tags around the outside of the part, like you see in Dragon moldings a lot, so that they have a place to punch it out. But then that might impact on some of the fit there, because you're going to need a very good fit to get all those to line up. So that may be a place you'd want to go for resin, depending on how well these fit. But overall, looking quite good. Next sprue, further catering to variations. We've got another intake with the fuselage surround, another intake lip, different surround for the rear fuselage, slightly different exhaust nozzles, slightly different turbine faces and flame holders, so obviously some different variants. So I imagine some of this is probably for the C version of the F-16 or the A. So I'm no expert, but obviously the F-16 experts in the audience can probably look at these and tell me exactly what they are. But still, I will say these exhaust pedals definitely look a little bit nicer than the other ones. Still a little bit of shrinkage on some here, but then again, these are relatively thick moldings. So that's going to be something they're going to have to fine-tune. Still would probably take a really fine scribing bit or back of a knife and just put a little bit of a slight undercut there to catch a wash. We do also have some small ejector pins on the inside face. And unfortunately, this has kind of a grid texture all over it, whereas the other one was kind of more on the flat areas, so these are going to be a lot harder to deal with. In this case, I think having all the extra little studs sticking out to give the ejector pins something to push against might have been a better way to go about it, but then again, that is not my area of expertise. Still, some ejector pins on the inside of the intake that'll need to be sanded down. Once again, the fuselage, not the sharpest panel lines, but they are consistent all the way around, which is definitely, like I said, I would take consistency over anything else. Turbine faces look good. Those will look really good painted up with a bit of a wash. And then, of course, one thing to note here, the actual intake has these little pins. And there are corresponding holes on the inside of the fuselage there, so those are going to align very positive. So those will locate without any sort of vague interpretation. Kind of like the Tamiya Phantom, where everything locates into very positive holes and pins, so you don't get anything misaligned, which is good to see. One thing to design a great kit, it's another thing to design it to be built. Next sprue is a double, and it does have a little bit of a curve to it, so obviously this one got popped out of the mold probably a little bit too soon. But like I said, early test shots, so that kind of stuff can be encountered, but obviously they're going to be fine-tuning the process so that you don't get this when you open up the box of the final product. We've got 3 different sets of main wheel here in left and right halves. I would have preferred having the tire and the hub separate. It makes painting a little bit easier, but hey, this works. Got some probably some missile rails for the wingtips and the pylons. Some, I guess those rudder pedals. Got our control column, which of course on the F-16 is on the side, not in the center. We've got the center section and the sides of our ejection seat. Those look very nice. Imagine a lot of people will probably spring for a resin one, but what we've got here looks pretty good. Got our drop tanks molded in 2 halves. Some very nice little raised rivets around what I would assume would be the filler points. Look very good. Got some our wing pylons, and those are in left and right halves. Those probably would have been too thick to mold as one piece, so be a little bit of a seam line front and rear to take care of, no big deal. We've got, pretty sure that's a triple ejector rack, so you definitely be able to sling some ordnance under this thing. Got our horizontal tail planes with, once again, with those static dischargers molded in place. A little pin there to mount to the fuselage, so it looks like we'll be able to pose these however we like. A few other little greeblies here. We've got probably what's going to be, when combined, a complete part of the engine. So they're hard to say how noticeable the seam over this sort of undulated area is going to be visible once it's together, but probably not a big deal. Once again, if it's something that's going to bother you, I'm sure there'll be resin exhaust components popped out for this kit once it hits the market. But yeah, it looks pretty good. Yeah, all I got to do is sort out that sort of warping on the sprues, and no problem there. Next, more fuselage and wing components. We got our lower fuselage, which is pretty much one piece from the radome to pretty much the rear. So obviously all of this doesn't change from variant to variant. But we do have 2 separate rear upper fuselage, and there are some subtle differences in the panels on along the spine here. So probably a difference between a C and an A, or perhaps, you know, American versus European, something like that. Once again, they are consistent. They don't seem to be they're not super sharp, but they're not exactly soft and fuzzy either. I'd say they're above average. Of course, getting this under a coat of paint would be the actual litmus test. But once again, even coming down the sides and along, nice and sharp, especially on the rear lower fuselage here. Coming, you know, obviously the mold is typically going to be coming this direction, so any detail along the sides usually has to meet a compromise of being able to come out of the mold. But as we come around, lots of nice rivet detail and panel lines perfectly intact along the corner here. So obviously Kinetic's pulling some wizardry and getting that detail in there, so that's nice to see. Panel lines on these flatter areas seem a little bit deeper, but could just be me. And once again, I'm going to say this a lot, this is an early test shot, so they are still figuring out and tweaking things, getting ready for final production. So all of these little things might just be because of its early nature and not actually something that's going to happen on the final product. We hope, anyway. Lower half of the wing molded separate. We've got holes for our pylons already opened up, or at least mostly opened up here. So if you don't want to do pylons or you're doing an air show bird, you will need to fill those in to some capacity. And we got some other parts here. I don't know if that's for the base of the fin, perhaps. This big protrusion on it, which is mirrored on the inside, so you don't have a big thick piece of plastic that's going to shrink, which is nice to see. It's got a little bit of detail on the inside. I believe these are our speed brakes on the real thing, so it would pop open. Although, unless you cut them, I'm not quite sure how you would display those, so I'm not quite sure why they would have the detail in there otherwise. And of course we see the spot where our horizontal tail is going to plug in, along with some slots here where our engine components are going to attach. It's good to see. So yeah. Of course, the F-16 is not a very big airplane, as you can see. Next sprue is another duplicate. We've got JDAMs, we've got LGBs, GBUs, ABCs, 1, 2, 3s. Lots of things that go boom. I've obviously got AGM-88 harms here. We got 1, 2, 3, 4 iterations of the Sidewinder. We've got our AMRAM, molded left and right halves. So that means you get 2 AMRAMs, 2 Sidewinders, 2 LGBs, 4 of this smaller GBU here, 2 JDAMs. So you can definitely do either ground attack or wild weasel. You definitely have some options. And of course there is a huge amount of aftermarket resin and 3D printed weapon sets that you can get as well if you really want to dress this up. Curious how they do the Sidewinders. Hopefully all those parts will match up well. Otherwise there's going to be some fiddly sanding and filling there on those. To me, I kind of did the same thing. I did the head separate from the rest of the missile just to take care of those different versions. Now we do have some ejector pins, but judging from those holes where it's going to attach to the pylon, you'll never see those, so no big deal. Overall looks pretty good. For weapons out of the box, definitely very good. And on top of our weapon sprue, we've got some targeting pods and some an ECM pod here, an ANALQ of some description. Of course, everything is molded left and right / top and bottom. Panel lines seem a little bit, they're sharp, but seem a little bit more shallow than on the rest of the model. But otherwise not too bad. Just, of course, anything that crosses the center line seam, you're going to have to do a little bit of rescribing anyway, so no sense complaining too much. Looks pretty good. And next sprue, and the biggest one in the kit, got our centerline drop tank. We got our nose wheel in left and right halves. We've got our nose cone or radome molded left and right as opposed to being molded in one piece. So curious they decided to do it that way. I guess most jet kits you have the nose cone sticking up out of the sprue and usually it gets bent over. So I guess they figured that would lead to less damage. Or I guess perhaps to have these little protrusions molded in, which you wouldn't be able to do if it was molded one piece. Got the combing for the instrument panel. We've got 1, 2, 3 different instrument panels. So that's probably catering to different variants, slash, I would assume one of these would be for the rear cockpit on the two-seater. And we've got our vertical fin with our separate rudder and different iterations of that, the base with the, I think it was a parachute housing if I'm not mistaken, depending on the variant. Of course, the leading edge of the vertical fin is molded to 1/2, and then the other half butts up against a panel line, so hide that join. Hopefully that's got a good fit to it. You've got the rearmost of the intake, which would lead to the front face of the engine. More ejector pins on the inside of there to, well, potentially fill. I'm not sure how much of this will be visible. The intake kind of dog legs under the cockpit there. And of course, got some detail for our main wheel bay here with a little bit of plumbing and some structure. Of course, if you've got the centerline tank, you're not going to see much of that anyway. Got some nice wiring and plumbing detail in the nose wheel bay there. A few other little greeblies and bits and bobs. And one thing I should mention is all of the sprue attachments, or the gates if you will, are all very, very small, even on the larger parts. So with a good pair of sprue cutters and some attention, you're not going to have much cleanup to do. Even on the pitot tube there, you got a sprue attachment right on the side, but it is very small, so that should make cleanup relatively easy. And what is definitely interesting is it looks like we have the complete radar dish or scanner under the nose cone here. So it looks like you could in theory leave that off and show off that radar, which is kind of cool. You could definitely do a little, have everything either buttoned up or wide open for display, up to you. So yeah, rivets seem a little bit soft on the fin, but not too bad. Said how you would have to see what they look like under a coat of paint. Now we do have that little panel in front of the cockpit with the bird slicers. There's little antenna blades on there, so that's probably, seeing how they're already molded on the fuselage, that must be for potentially the two-seat variants or some other leftover for when they do other options. But just yet another clue of things to come. And of course, 2 different surrounds for that Vulcan gun, so variant dependent. But yeah, lots to look forward to, definitely. And nice to look at, of course. But then again, looking at the sprues only tells us so much. It's how it goes together is where you sink or swim. And last but not least, we have the clear sprue, leaving no doubt that there will be a 2-seat F-16 in the future, as we have the canopy already on here, alongside the single seat canopy, of course. Now there is a very, very fine seam down the center line, but it is almost not even there. I would wager you could probably remove that with maybe just working through the polishing compounds, or a quick little swipe with like 4,000 or 6,000 grit sandpaper, and then polish it up from there. Some nice rivet detail molded around the canopies, which is always nice to see, and the painted areas, or what will be the painted areas, are textured as opposed to the rest of the canopy being perfectly polished clear. Just a little bit more of an aid to help mask that off. And some various other little bits of clear part here. Obviously probably some lenses and seeker heads for some of the pods and missiles, landing lights, probably the heads-up display, things of that nature. But of course, how clear are these? Now, looking straight down, pretty darn good. You start kind of rotating it around and definitely getting a lot of distortion from that lensing you get from basically that omega shape of the omega cross section of the canopy is going to distort that. So from the side, you're going to have a fair amount of distortion, but looking straight down into the cockpit, like most judges do, you're going to have everything on display. And of course, if maximum visibility is important, just pop the canopy open. So there you have it, the new 1/48 scale F-16 from Kinetic. It's always great to see manufacturers not sit on their hands and say, hey, the one we got is good enough. Kinetic's basically said, no, the one we had isn't good enough. We're going to do a better one. Here it is. And I will say, from just looking at the parts, definitely better than the old one. Of course, the proof in the pudding is going to be how well it goes together, because the original Kinetic F-16 does have a reputation for being a bit of a hog to put together. This example is, of course, an extremely early test shot. So some of those warpages and shrinkage we see here are definitely not going to be passing quality control on the final kit. At least we hope so. But once the production kit does hit shelves, we will have a look at one of those and compare it to our test shot here, just to see if there's any differences, of course, just so you guys know exactly what you're going to be getting when you go and crack open the box you just picked up. This kit was very kindly provided by Raymond, Mr. Kinetic Models himself. Thank you very much. If you'd like to see more content like this, make sure to click like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and we'll catch you next time.